Sir, your parents are at the gate claiming an emergency. The words hit me like a spark on dry wood, and a smirk spread across my face. Not the warm, forgiving kind of smile you give to someone you love, but the cold, calculated grin of someone who had waited 8 long years for this exact moment. I could see them through the security monitors, my parents standing there, dressed in expensive jackets, looking out of place beside a rented SUV. Their expressions were frantic, their composure broken. The same parents who had tossed me out of our home like garbage the moment I turned 18. My name is Alex, and I'm 26 now. But let me take you back to when I was 18, standing in the living room of our family house, on what should have been one of the happiest days of my life, my birthday. Instead, my mother's face was twisted in anger, eyes flashing with contempt. She pointed at the door, as if it were the gateway to my unworthiness. "You're a worthless mistake of my life," she spat, her voice sharp enough to cut through bone. "Get out. Never come back." It was supposed to be a normal evening. I had just returned from my part-time job at the local electronics store, tired but hoping for a small celebration. Maybe a cake, maybe a moment of acknowledgement. What I got instead was a nightmare I wouldn't be able to forget for years. My mother was standing there with printed bank statements, my backpack already packed, and my father sat silently in his recliner, avoiding my gaze as if pretending I didn't exist. In one brutal monologue, my mother revealed the truth that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my life. I wasn't my father's son. I was the product of an affair she had years ago, a secret she refused to name or acknowledge until now. She had kept me around out of obligation, but now legally I was her responsibility no longer. The college fund she had promised me, already spent on renovating the kitchen last year, the enrollment in the university I had dreamed about, withdrawn that very morning, and my father, the man who had taught me to ride a bike, who had cheered at every school game, who had told me I could achieve anything. I looked to him, silently pleading, and he simply muttered, "Margaret has made her decision." 18 years of calling him Dad, and he chose silence over me, action over truth, and loyalty over love. The cruelest part wasn't even discovering who my real father was. It was realizing how long this had been planned. Months of family dinners where she smiled at me, counting down the days until my expulsion. Months of helping me prepare for colleges I would never attend. Months of letting me dream a life she had already decided I would not have. She handed me the backpack. Inside, exactly $47. "Generous," she said, considering I wasn't really part of her family. Then, without hesitation, she pushed me toward the door, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my shoulder. Neighbors might have been watching, but she didn't care. She wanted witnesses to her performance, proof of her cruelty. 20 minutes. That was all it took to go from having a family to having nothing. 20 minutes to erase 18 years of love, trust, and dreams. I stood on the porch, the wind cold against my skin, holding my pathetic backpack. I could hear the deadbolt click behind me. Through the window, I saw her pouring herself a glass of wine, already celebrating my absence. And in that moment, a seed of determination was planted in me. I wouldn't just survive. I would come back stronger, and I would prove to them and to the world that their cruelty had created something they never expected. For the first few nights after being kicked out, I wandered the streets, couch surfing with acquaintances from school, trying to hold back the wave of anger and betrayal that threatened to drown me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's face, her words echoing relentlessly. Every time I tried to think of my father, his silence haunted me even more than her screaming. How could someone who had promised to love you unconditionally simply vanish the moment it was convenient? I quickly realized that no one was coming to save me. The world wasn't going to hand me a college degree, a warm bed, or a sense of belonging. I had 2 options: give up and accept a life of bitterness, or fight back and build something of my own. And I chose the latter. I took odd jobs, delivering newspapers, stacking shelves, cleaning offices at night. It was grueling work, exhausting in ways I hadn't imagined. But with every dollar I earned, with every moment I survived on my own, I felt a strange power growing inside me. I was no longer their worthless mistake. I was Alex, and I was starting to define myself. School became my refuge. I threw myself into learning, into every class and every subject I could master. Mathematics, science, literature. I devoured knowledge like it was fuel. My parents had tried to break me, but they had unknowingly given me the perfect motivation, the desire to prove that I could rise above their cruelty. And as the years passed, that anger transformed. It became focus. It became determination. Every rejection, every insult, every sneer I had endured was stored like coal in a furnace inside me. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building momentum. By the time I turned 20, I was no longer the scared, abandoned boy who had stood on the porch clutching $47. I was someone who had learned how to navigate the world alone, how to find allies in unexpected places, and how to turn hardship into opportunity. Every door slammed in my face became a step toward the life I was going to claim for myself. And yet, even with all that progress, the memory of that night never left me. It lingered in quiet moments, walking down empty streets, staring at my reflection in a cracked mirror, or sitting in a cafe alone with my thoughts. That night had been a lesson in human cruelty, in betrayal, and in the fragile nature of trust. But more importantly, it was a lesson in resilience. I began to understand something crucial. The people who abandon you are not always the ones who define your worth. Sometimes the harshest pain is the spark that ignites the strongest fire. And I made a silent promise to myself, one day, I would return not out of vengeance, but out of triumph. I would live a life so full, so undeniable, that they could not ignore it. They had given me nothing but pain, but I would turn it into everything before I continue tell. From which place are you watching this story right now? Please subscribe and like the video for motivation. The first few nights on the streets were worse than I could have imagined. The city at night felt like a predator, every shadow a potential threat, every sound amplified into a warning I couldn't escape. I carried my backpack, which now felt heavier than ever, not because of the $47 inside, but because of the weight of abandonment, humiliation, and fear pressing down on me. I wasn't just a boy with nowhere to go. I was a boy who had been discarded, a human being deemed disposable by the people who were supposed to love him most. I found shelter where I could. Sometimes it was an empty stairwell behind a closed store. Other times it was a friend's couch. Though I hated imposing on anyone, each night I felt my body ache, my stomach twist in hunger, and yet there was a fire in me I couldn't extinguish. A quiet voice kept whispering in my mind, "They wanted you gone." Prove they were wrong. The first morning after being kicked out, I wandered the streets, unsure where to even begin. I passed by familiar places from my childhood. The park where my dad had taught me to ride my bike. The library where I had spent countless hours reading. Fantasy books that now felt like distant worlds. Every place carried memories, but they also carried the sharp sting of absence. My parents' betrayal had made me feel invisible in the world. I once knew money was tight, hunger constant, and sleep a luxury I couldn't afford. I learned quickly to adapt. Odd jobs became my lifeline. I delivered newspapers, stacked shelves at the convenience store, and even cleaned offices at night. The fluorescent lights burning into my eyes as my hands scrubbed floors that no one would ever notice were spotless. Each job was grueling, and yet every small paycheck brought a sliver of pride. I was surviving. I was building myself from scratch. School became both a distraction and a lifeline. I immersed myself in textbooks, notes, and late-night library sessions. While other kids worried about parties and relationships, I worried about survival, about building the skills I would need to carve out a life that belonged to me. Knowledge became my armor and determination became my sword. The boy my parents had cast aside was transforming into someone they could never have imagined, but it wasn't easy. People stared when I showed up in tattered clothes, or when my worn-out shoes squeaked on the linoleum floors of my school. Teachers occasionally noticed, their pity barely hidden in sympathetic glances, and classmates whispered behind my back. Every insult, every moment of judgment fueled something deeper inside me. Anger, yes, but also focus. Every slight, every sneer, every dismissal became a brick in the foundation. I was building for my future. I didn't just want to survive, I wanted to thrive. And slowly I began to see the path. I realized I didn't need my parents' approval, their money, or their love to succeed. I only needed myself, a clear mind, and the willingness to push harder than anyone else. The world was harsh, but I was willing to be harsher with myself if it meant I could rise, and friendships were tricky. Trust didn't come easily after betrayal of this magnitude. I learned to read people quickly, to sense when someone's kindness was genuine or when it was just another way to take advantage of me. I began forming alliances with people who understood struggle, who had also clawed their way from nothing. Together we shared advice, food, and small victories that reminded me I wasn't completely alone. Money remained a constant struggle. $47 was long gone. Spent on food, clothes, and occasional shelter. I learned the value of every cent, the weight of every decision. Could I spend this on a bus ticket to the library, where I could study for hours and improve my chances of scholarships? Or should I spend it on a small meal to keep my stomach from gnawing through my focus? Every choice was a lesson in survival, strategy, and delayed gratification, and then came the moments that made it worth it. The small victories that hinted I was capable of more. A teacher praised my essay. A customer at work complimented my reliability. A stranger offered advice that opened a new door I hadn't even known existed. Each of these moments, tiny as they were, became fuel for my fire. They reminded me that even in a world that had discarded me, there was space to grow, to succeed, to prove my worth. By the end of that first year on my own, I had learned things no teenager should have to learn. I learned the cruelty of people who judge before they know, the resilience required to face hunger and exhaustion, and the power that comes from self-reliance. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was transforming. The boy thrown out at 18 was gone, replaced by someone stronger, sharper, and unafraid of struggle. And yet, even as I adapted, even as I thrived in small ways, there was a constant shadow over me, the knowledge of what my parents had done. It was a wound that never fully healed, and in quiet moments it burned. But I realized something crucial. That wound, their betrayal, was also my fuel. It had lit a fire I couldn't have found anywhere else. Every setback, every insult, every instance of abandonment became a spark to drive me forward. Knew one day I wouldn't just survive, would return, not for revenge, not for confrontation, but to live a life so full, so undeniable, that the people who had cast me aside could not ignore it. They had given me nothing but pain, and I would turn it into everything. By the time I was 19, the world had begun to feel a little less like an enemy and a little more like a challenge. I could face head-on. The nights were still cold, the hunger still gnawed at me, and the loneliness still pressed down in ways words could barely describe. But I had learned to carry the weight of life on my own shoulders, to move through the city with purpose rather than despair. Every day was a test, and for the first time in my life, I was determined to pass. School had become my sanctuary. I buried myself in books, in lessons, in every assignment that teachers handed out. I wasn't doing it for grades anymore. I was doing it for something far more important, my future. Knowledge was power, and power was a way to ensure no one could ever dismiss me again. Nights spent in libraries, hunched over textbooks under flickering fluorescent lights, were exhausting, but they were mine. Every page I turned, every problem I solved, became a stepping stone, away from the boy my parents had tried to break. Jobs kept me fed and provided a rhythm to my days. I worked mornings, afternoons, and nights, juggling shifts like a performer walking a tightrope. Exhaustion became a companion, but so did pride. I learned that there was no shame in hard work, no dignity in expecting the world to hand you something you hadn't earned. The first time I counted my paycheck and realized I had enough for rent and books, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: control. I was building my own life, one careful decision at a time. Friends came slowly. Trust was a delicate currency, one I had spent foolishly in the past and had no intention of losing again. But I found allies, people who had faced hardship themselves, who understood that life could be cruel and unfair. We shared advice, food, and strategies for surviving in a world that had forgotten us. In their company, I discovered a strength I hadn't known existed: the ability to rely on others without surrendering my independence. Opportunities began to appear, subtle at first. A teacher noticed my dedication and suggested I apply for a scholarship program. A customer at work offered advice about starting a small business, noting my diligence and reliability. Even small victories, like completing a complex assignment or earning a bonus for hard work, became milestones in a journey that had once felt impossible. Each one reinforced a truth I was beginning to accept. I could shape my life with my own hands, and no one could take that away from me. But alongside the victories were the setbacks. Nights when the streets seemed emptier and colder. Mornings when my body refused to move from exhaustion. And moments when self-doubt crept in, whispering that maybe I wasn't enough. I learned to face those moments head-on, to let the fear sharpen me rather than stop me. Each failure was a lesson, each hardship a teacher. The boy who had been abandoned was transforming. into a man who refused to be broken. By the time I turned 20, I had started to see a vision of the life I wanted. It wasn't about wealth, though I knew money would bring freedom. It wasn't about revenge, though part of me longed to prove them wrong. It was about self-mastery, independence, and a life lived on my terms. I began planning carefully, methodically. Every choice I made, every hour I spent, was a deliberate step toward becoming the man I knew I could be. I found a small apartment above a bookstore, a modest place that cost more than I was comfortable with, but it was mine. No one could throw me out. No one could tell me I didn't belong. Every night I fell asleep there, exhausted from work and study. I felt a quiet satisfaction. I was building a foundation for the life I had always dreamed of. And every brick was laid with my own hands. The torture, anger I had felt toward my parents never fully disappeared. It lingered, sharp and bitter, a constant reminder of the injustice I had endured. But over time it became fuel rather than poison. Every insult, every betrayal, every moment of humiliation I had experienced became motivation. I wanted to prove to myself first and the world second that I was not the mistake they had declared me to be. And slowly, the pieces began to come together. I applied for scholarships, landed better jobs, and met mentors who offered guidance I had never known at home. I discovered talents and skills I hadn't realized I possessed. I learned to negotiate, to persuade, to push past the fear that had once frozen me in place. I was no longer a passive victim of circumstance. I was an active architect of my destiny. Yet even as I progressed, I knew the journey was far from over. The pain of being discarded had left a mark that would never fully fade. Memories of that March evening, the shouting, the betrayal, the cold shove out the door, still haunted me in quiet moments. But now, instead of crippling me, they drove me. I carried them like armor, a shield that reminded me why I could not give up, why I had to succeed. By the time I turned 21, I had a small network of friends, a steady job, and a clearer path to a future I had once thought impossible. Every dollar I earned, every skill I learned, every relationship I nurtured was another step toward the life I was determined to claim. I was still Alex, the boy who had been thrown out, but I was also someone new, someone stronger, someone capable of turning pain into power. And in the quiet moments, when I looked back at the streets, the empty apartments, and the people who had doubted me, I felt a strange satisfaction. I was no longer running. I was climbing, step by step, decision by decision. I was reclaiming the life that had been stolen from me. And I knew deep down that one day the world and the people who had abandoned me would see what I had become. The time I turned 22, the life I was building had started to show the first signs of real progress. The nights were no longer just about surviving. They were about planning, strategizing, and chasing opportunities I had never imagined possible. I had a small apartment, steady work, and a routine that kept me moving forward. But it wasn't enough to simply exist. I wanted more. I needed more. I wanted a life where my past didn't define me, but where my resilience did. One evening, after a long day working at the electronics store and attending night classes, I stumbled upon an online ad for a small entrepreneurship competition. The prize wasn't huge, but it promised mentorship and a network, things I had desperately needed all these years. I hesitated at first, thinking about the countless times life had shut doors in my face, the numerous times I had failed or been rejected. But something inside me whispered, "This is your chance. Stop waiting for someone else to give you permission." I applied, pouring every ounce of effort I had into the proposal. I stayed up nights drafting, editing, and rewriting, fueled by caffeine, adrenaline, and the memory of that night when my mother had called me a worthless mistake. Every sentence I typed, every idea I proposed was a declaration. I was not worthless. I was not defined by abandonment. I was Alex, and I was claiming my place in the world. Weeks later, I got the email. I had been accepted as one of the finalists. My heart raced not just from excitement, but from the knowledge that this was the first time something tangible had come from my hard work. I was being recognized not as the kid my parents had discarded, but as someone with potential, someone capable of creating impact. The competition itself was grueling. I faced other participants who had resources, support, and experience I had never known. I felt the weight of my insecurities pressing down on me. But then I remembered all the nights I had spent hungry, cold, and exhausted. I remembered the countless times I had been told I was not enough. And suddenly those feelings of inadequacy became fuel. I wasn't competing just against them, I was competing against the version of me that had been thrown out. The scared, abandoned boy who had once felt powerless. The judges asked questions, challenged assumptions, and tested our resolve. I answered honestly, drawing on the lessons life had taught me far beyond any textbook. I spoke about resilience, strategy, and the importance of turning adversity into opportunity. I told them about nights spent on the streets, jobs that barely paid, and the determination that kept me moving forward. My story, raw and unfiltered, seemed to resonate. I realized then that my past, the very thing I had once considered a curse, was now my greatest asset. When they announced the winner, my name was called. I felt a wave of disbelief, followed by a flood of emotions I had tried to suppress for years. Pride, relief, and an undeniable sense of vindication. I had achieved something meaningful with nothing but determination, grit, and the lessons of survival. For the first time, I felt like the universe was acknowledging my worth. Not through the people who had abandoned me, but through my own hard work. That victory became a turning point. It opened doors to mentorships, networking opportunities, and a chance to start my first small venture. I invested every dollar I had saved, every skill I had learned, and every ounce of resilience I had cultivated. Slowly, the boy, who had stood on the porch clutching $47, was transforming into a man who could create, innovate, and lead. Yet the journey was far from easy. The world didn't suddenly become forgiving, and challenges continued to arise. There were setbacks, failed pitches, and moments when the stress felt unbearable. But I had learned to persevere, to see failure not as a reflection of my worth, but as a lesson. Each obstacle became a stepping stone, each rejection a guidepost directing me toward better strategies, sharper decisions, and greater opportunities. Even as my career and skills grew, I never forgot where I came from. I remembered the streets, the hunger, the nights when I had nothing but determination and stubborn hope. Those memories kept me grounded, humble, and hungry for success. I didn't just want to succeed for myself. I wanted to prove that the circumstances of your past, no matter how cruel, do not define your future. By the end of that year, my small venture was gaining traction. Clients, partners, and mentors were starting to notice my work ethic, creativity, and relentless drive. I had created a foundation that no one could take away, and the thought of returning to the life I had been forced out of no longer carried bitterness. It carried anticipation. One day, the people who had doubted me, who had abandoned me, would see what I had built with nothing but determination and resilience, and they would have to acknowledge it. But more importantly, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't in proving them wrong, it was in proving to myself that I could overcome any obstacle, survive any betrayal, and rise above any challenge. That was the lesson life had forced upon me. Your past does not define you. Your choices do. And if you are willing to fight, endure, and learn, there is nothing in this world that can hold you back. The time I was 23, my life had shifted dramatically. The boy who had been abandoned on the porch with $47 was now running a small but promising venture. I had mentors, clients, and a growing reputation for dedication and innovation. Yet despite the successes, a shadow lingered over me, a reminder of how easily everything could be taken away. Life had taught me that victories are fragile, and the higher you climb, the steeper the falls. The test came unexpectedly. A major client, one whose contract could make or break my fledgling business, threatened to pull out. They claimed my work didn't meet expectations, and suddenly months of effort and progress hung by a thread. Panic tried to creep in, that familiar voice of self-doubt that had haunted me since my parents' betrayal. But I refused to let fear dictate my actions. I reminded myself of every hardship I had endured, the hunger, the cold nights, the exhaustion, and the betrayal. If I had survived that, I could survive this. I poured every ounce of energy I had into fixing the situation. Late nights turned into early mornings as I revised, refined, and rebuilt. I communicated constantly with the client, presenting solutions, taking responsibility for missteps, and showing the dedication that had become my trademark. The pressure was immense. I questioned myself constantly. Was I really ready? Could I handle the scrutiny? But then I remembered my past. I remembered the night my mother had shoved me out the door, the emptiness I had felt, and the determination that had carried me forward. I couldn't let this slip through my fingers, not because of pride, but because I owed it to myself. Meanwhile, the emotional storm outside my professional life was just as turbulent. My parents had heard about my small successes, and suddenly, there were calls, messages, and even unannounced visits. My mother, in particular, seemed to oscillate between feigned concern and thinly veiled judgment. My father remained mostly silent, observing, occasionally offering a word of acknowledgement, but it carried none of the warmth it should have. Part of me wanted to ignore them, to shut the door on the past completely. Another part, however, was curious. How could people who had cast me aside now act as if they mattered? I chose boundaries. I engaged minimally, keeping my focus on my work, my goals, and the life I was building. It was difficult, especially when old feelings of longing and abandonment resurfaced. But I had learned an essential lesson. Your past does not have the power to define you unless you let it. My parents' actions had hurt me, but they could not dictate my choices, my resilience, or my future. The breakthrough came after weeks of relentless effort. The client called me back not just satisfied, but impressed. They praised my dedication, adaptability, and ingenuity. The contract not only remained intact but expanded. My small venture had survived its first true test, and I had done it without sacrificing my values or integrity. The sense of triumph was profound, not because I had proven anyone else wrong, but because I had proven to myself that I could face pressure, fear, and doubt, and still rise. The experience also taught me the value of perseverance and adaptability. Success was not a straight path. It was a series of trials, each designed to teach resilience, patience, and strategy. I began to approach every challenge with a mindset honed by hardship. Assess, adapt, execute. Every obstacle became a lesson, every failure a stepping stone. During this time, I also invested in personal growth. I took courses in leadership, communication, and strategy. I networked with people who had faced adversity themselves, learning from their experiences and applying those lessons to my life. I began to understand that success wasn't just about talent or hard work. It was about mindset, endurance, and the ability to transform setbacks into fuel for growth. And yet, the deepest lesson of all came quietly, in reflection. I realized that the greatest victories weren't about wealth, contracts, or recognition. They were about reclaiming your sense of self, proving to yourself that no matter what the world, or even those closest to you, throws your way, you have the power to rise, to create, and to thrive. The pain of being discarded had been a harsh teacher, but it had also been the catalyst for everything I was achieving now. By the end of that year, my business had grown steadily, and I had established routines, strategies, and a mindset that would carry me forward. I had survived betrayal, rejection, and doubt. I had faced fear, uncertainty, and near failure, and I had emerged stronger, smarter, and more determined than ever. I wasn't just rebuilding a life, I was reclaiming it. The boy who had once stood on the porch, abandoned and humiliated, had transformed into a man who could navigate the world with skill, resilience, and vision. And while the past would always be a part of me, it no longer held power over me. It had become my teacher, my motivator, and the foundation upon which I built everything. The time I was 24, my life had transformed in ways I could hardly have imagined during those long nights on the streets. My small venture was no longer just surviving, it was thriving. Contracts were multiplying, clients were referring new business, and my reputation for reliability, creativity, and grit was spreading. Every achievement was a quiet victory against the boy I once was, the one my parents had declared worthless. Each success was a silent message to the world. Alex wasn't to be ignored, but success, I learned quickly, comes with its own shadows. As my venture grew, so did the pressure. Every client demand, every unexpected complication, every minor failure was amplified, leaving no room for error. I worked tirelessly, often 16-hour days, living on little sleep and barely enough rest to recharge my body. My mind was constantly occupied with decisions, strategies, and the relentless drive to keep moving forward. There were moments when exhaustion and doubt threatened to overwhelm me, but the memory of being thrown out, abandoned, and belittled reminded me of one undeniable truth. I had already survived the worst. Anything else was just another challenge to overcome. And then there were my parents. They had heard whispers of my growing success and began to show up in subtle, calculated ways. Messages of congratulations, casual inquiries about my life, and even unannounced visits. I resisted the urge to engage fully. The anger that had simmered for years hadn't disappeared, but I had learned the power of control. I could respond with composure rather than impulse. I could choose when and how to interact with them, if at all. I was no longer the boy who needed validation from those who had discarded him. One particular day, I received an invitation from a high-profile networking event, an opportunity to pitch my venture to investors who could transform my small operation into something far bigger. It was intimidating, yes, but it also felt like destiny. This was a chance to elevate everything I had worked for, a moment that could change the trajectory of my life. I prepared meticulously, studying potential investors, refining my pitch, and rehearsing every possible question they might ask. Every detail mattered. Failure wasn't an option, not now, not after everything I had endured. The day of the event, I stepped into a room filled with polished professionals, experienced entrepreneurs, and skeptical investors. For a brief moment, nerves threatened to take over. But then I reminded myself of every long night, every job, every lesson learned on the streets, in classrooms, and at countless workplaces. I wasn't just a presenter, I was a survivor, a creator, and someone who had earned the right to stand in that room. Delivered my pitch with clarity, confidence, and passion. I spoke not just about my venture, but about the values and resilience behind it. I shared the story of struggle, determination, and self-reliance, though I framed it in a way that highlighted my journey rather than eliciting pity. Investors leaned in, engaged with my ideas, and asked probing questions that I answered with precision and honesty. By the end of the session, I could feel the shift, skepticism turning into interest, doubt transforming into respect. Weeks later, the results came in. Not only had I secured a substantial investment, but I had also gained mentors willing to guide me through the next stages of growth. The business I had painstakingly built from scratch was now poised for exponential growth. For the first time, I realized that all those years of hardship had not only prepared me for success, they had made me unstoppable. Yet, amidst the triumph, life reminded me that success is rarely a straight path. Challenges continued to appear, market fluctuations, staff issues, and unexpected personal trials. One evening, while reviewing contracts, I received a call from my mother. Her voice was calm, almost polite. But beneath the surface, I could sense the old patterns: manipulation, guilt-tripping, and thinly veiled authority. She wanted to reconnect, but I knew the timing wasn't innocent. I had grown too much to fall for old traps. I listened, responded carefully, and maintained boundaries. For the first time, I understood the value of emotional control, of protecting not just my assets, but my peace. During quiet moments, I reflected on my journey. I remembered the porch, the $47, the rejection, and the nights of despair. I realized that while life had tested me relentlessly, it had also gifted me invaluable lessons: perseverance, strategy, self-reliance, and the ability to transform pain into power. The boy who had been thrown out at 18 had grown into a man who could face any storm without losing himself. By the end of that year, my business was thriving, my reputation was solid, and my personal life had begun to stabilize. I had mentors, allies, and friends who truly understood me. I had learned that success was not just about achieving goals. It was about maintaining integrity, building resilience, and turning adversity into an engine for growth. And I knew, deep in my heart, that one day, the people who had once dismissed me would have to see what I had become. Not for revenge, but as a testament to the power of perseverance and the unyielding human spirit. By the time I was 26, the life I had painstakingly built was no longer small, fragile, or uncertain. My business had grown beyond what I had dared to imagine in those long nights on the streets. Contracts, partnerships, and recognition had multiplied. I had mentors who believed in me, a team that relied on my leadership, and the kind of respect that could only come from someone who had earned it the hard way. And yet the final test of my journey was not about money, contracts, or accolades. It was about closure, confrontation, and claiming my story fully. It started with a simple visit from my mother and father. They had come to see me, to reconnect. But the truth was clear. They wanted to witness the success they had tried to deny me, to gauge how far the boy they had abandoned had risen. I felt the familiar twinge of old anger, but this time I was ready. I wasn't the scared, powerless boy on the porch. I was Alex, the man who had taken pain, betrayal, and rejection and transformed it into an unstoppable force. We met in my office, the space I had built from nothing. I could see the surprise in their eyes as they took in the results of years of determination, my thriving business, the team working efficiently, and the confidence radiating from me. My mother's lips trembled as if she had rehearsed her words, but no words could erase the past. My father's silence lingered, heavy with unspoken guilt. I didn't need apologies. I didn't need validation. I had already achieved the one thing they could never take away: self-respect and proof that I was enough. I spoke calmly, my voice steady. I told them about my journey, not to gloat, but to affirm the lessons that had carried me through every hardship. I told them about the nights I went hungry, the jobs I worked tirelessly, the lessons I learned from every failure, and the relentless pursuit of my goals. I told them that their abandonment had shaped me, but it did not define me. And in that room I felt a release, as if years of pain had finally been acknowledged, not through their words, but through my own resilience. The encounter ended without confrontation, without anger, but with an unspoken understanding. I had reclaimed my life. The people who had once dismissed me no longer had power over me. And I realized that true victory is not revenge. It is living fully, authentically, and without fear. It is taking every hardship and using it to propel yourself forward, rather than allowing it to anchor you in bitterness. In the months that followed, my venture expanded further, and I began mentoring others who had faced adversity. I shared my story, not for sympathy, but as a testament to the power of resilience. I emphasized one core lesson: life will test you, often cruelly, and people may abandon you, underestimate you, or even try to destroy your dreams. But the measure of a person is not in the hand they are dealt. It is in what they do with it. You can choose to crumble under pressure, or you can choose to rise, to fight, and to thrive. Looking back now, I see the boy on the porch clutching $47, scared, abandoned, and alone. And I see the man I have become, resilient, successful, and unshakable. The journey was long, painful, and at times unbearable. But every challenge, every betrayal, every moment of despair was a lesson in disguise. They taught me endurance, strategy, focus, and, most importantly, the power of self-belief, the biggest lesson I carry forward, and the one I hope everyone who hears my story takes to heart, is this: your past does not define your future. The people who abandon, betray, or underestimate you cannot determine your worth. What determines your life is not what happens to you, but how you respond. Every hardship is a seed of strength. Every rejection is a lesson. Every setback is a step forward if you are willing to learn, fight, and keep going. I am Alex. I was a worthless mistake once. But today I am proof that nothing in this world, including betrayal, abandonment, or cruelty, can stop someone determined to rise. And as I look ahead, I know one undeniable truth: the person you are becoming is far more powerful than the person you were, as long as you refuse to give up.